October 24, 1942. Guadalcanal. The jungle is black, wet, and breathing. Rain hangs in the air like smoke. Mud pulls at boots. Mosquitoes swarm over exposed skin. Somewhere beyond the tree line, Japanese voices rise and fall, short commands moving closer. The night is alive with intent. At the edge of Henderson Field, a Marine position waits in silence. Sandbags sag. Barbed wire disappears into darkness. The men inside the perimeter are exhausted, hollow-eyed, running on hours of sleep stretched across weeks of combat. Then the firing starts. Rifle cracks. Machine guns answer. Tracers slash through palm trunks. One gun jams. Then another. Steam hisses from overheated metal. Ammunition belts twist. Tripods sink into mud. In the center of it all, one Marine moves without panic. He doesn't retreat. He doesn't wait for orders. He drags broken guns together under fire. He strips parts with bare hands. He reroutes belts. He ignores burns blistering his palms. When the weapon comes back to life, it doesn't fire in bursts. It roars, sustained, relentless, minute after minute. Japanese assault waves break apart in the dark, cut down or forced flat into the mud. The rate of fire is overwhelming. The effect is immediate. The line holds. By dawn, the jungle falls quiet again. What happened that night wasn't planned, issued, or approved, but it would become one of the most lethal improvised moments of the Pacific War. This is how the world arrived at that night. By the autumn of 1942, the Pacific War had already become something the planners in Washington had not fully anticipated. It was not clean. It was not fast. And it was not controlled by maps alone. Guadalcanal was never meant to be a symbol. It was meant to be an airstrip. In early August 1942, U.S. forces landed on the island as part of Operation Watchtower, the first major Allied offensive against Imperial Japan. The objective was simple in theory: seize the unfinished Japanese airfield, later named Henderson Field, and prevent Japan from using it to threaten Allied supply lines between the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. But simplicity vanished the moment Marines stepped into the jungle. Guadalcanal was heat without mercy. Humidity rotted uniforms and weapons alike. Rain flooded foxholes. Insects carried disease. Visibility was measured in yards, not miles. The terrain erased the advantage of armor and long-range artillery. Combat became close, personal, and brutally repetitive. For Japan, Guadalcanal became a matter of honor and momentum. After a string of early victories across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy could not afford to lose ground, especially to a force they still underestimated. Reinforcements were pushed down the Tokyo Express, nightly destroyer runs that slipped troops onto the island under cover of darkness. By October, both sides were bleeding. The Marines defending Henderson Field were a mix of regulars, reservists, and replacements who had learned jungle warfare the hard way. Their doctrine emphasized discipline and firepower, but much of their equipment was still optimized for a different kind of war, one with clearer lines, firmer ground, and predictable engagements. The Japanese, meanwhile, adapted quickly. They favored night attacks, infiltration, and massed infantry assaults designed to overwhelm defensive positions through shock and momentum. Bugle calls, shouted commands, and sudden charges were meant to disorient defenders already pushed to the edge by exhaustion. Night after night, Marines fought in darkness broken only by muzzle flashes and flares. Machine guns became the spine of the defense. Weapons like the Browning M1917 and M1919 were designed to dominate open ground with sustained fire. On Guadalcanal, they were dragged into mud, jammed by sand, and overheated under continuous use. Water-cooled systems ran dry. Air-cooled barrels glowed red. Resupply was unreliable. Replacement parts were scarce. Maintenance manuals meant little when a gun failed during a charge measured in seconds. And yet, the defensive line could not break. Henderson Field was more than a strip of dirt, it was air superiority itself. Every Japanese aircraft destroyed on the ground, every bomber intercepted at altitude, depended on Marines holding that perimeter through the night. By late October, intelligence warned of a major Japanese push. Thousands of troops were moving into position. Artillery was being hauled through the jungle. Commanders on both sides understood what was coming. The Marines dug in deeper. Ammunition was stacked within arm's reach. Machine gun crews rehearsed arcs of fire by memory, knowing they might never see their targets clearly. In these conditions, battlefield doctrine began to give way to instinct. Survival no longer depended solely on training, it depended on adaptation. On whether a Marine could keep his weapon firing when it was never meant to fire that long. on whether broken equipment could be made lethal again under pressure. And as the nights grew louder and closer, one position on the perimeter would become the proving ground for that reality, where necessity, improvisation, and sheer refusal to yield converged under fire. The second layer of this story begins there, with the men, the weapons, and the circumstances that made such an action not just possible, but inevitable. The Marines holding the perimeter around Henderson Field in October 1942 were no longer fighting as part of a broad offensive. They were fighting to keep something alive. Most of the men had landed in August with light equipment and limited expectation of a prolonged campaign. What they faced instead was a grinding battle of attrition, one where logistics, maintenance, and endurance mattered as much as marksmanship. The unit sectors around the airfield were thinly held. Defensive lines stretched across jungle, kunai grass, and partially cleared ground. Fields of fire had to be hacked out by hand. Every position was vulnerable to infiltration. Japanese patrols moved silently, sometimes slipping through gaps undetected until they were already behind Marine lines. In this environment, the machine gun was not simply a support weapon. It was the difference between cohesion and collapse. The Browning M1917, a water-cooled .30 caliber machine gun, had proven itself in the First World War as a weapon capable of sustained fire over long periods. On Guadalcanal, however, water was not always available. Cans were emptied to cool overheated barrels. When the water jackets ran dry, crews risked catastrophic failure or steam venting that revealed their position. The M1919, its air-cooled counterpart, was lighter and more mobile, but it overheated faster. Barrel changes were theoretically straightforward, but only if spare barrels were on hand. The gun was clean and there was time to do it. Time was exactly what night assaults did not allow. Japanese attacks often came in waves, probing for weakness, then pushing hard once contact was made. Assault troops moved low and fast, closing distance before defenders could fully identify targets. Grenades followed. Then bayonets. Machine gun crews were prime targets. Once a gun went silent, an entire section of the line could unravel. It was within this reality that Sergeant John Basilone of the U.S. Marine Corps found himself during the battle for Henderson Field, part of the larger Battle of Guadalcanal. Basilone was not an officer. He was a gunnery sergeant in responsibility, if not in rank yet, a seasoned machine gun section leader who understood both his weapons and his men. On the night of October 24 to 25, 1942, Japanese forces launched a major ground assault aimed directly at the airfield. Thousands of troops advanced against Marine positions, supported by artillery and mortars. The attack was coordinated, determined, and relentless. Basilone's section was positioned along a critical avenue of approach. The terrain funneled attackers forward. It was ideal ground for machine gun defense, if the guns could stay operational. As the assault intensified, Basilone's guns began to fail. Overheating. Jams. Broken components. Ammunition belts fouled with mud. In the chaos of night combat, replacing a gun was not an option. Retreat would have opened the line. Instead, Basilone moved. Under fire, he ran between positions. He cleared jams by hand. He dragged disabled guns back into action. When one weapon went down, he cannibalized parts from another. When ammunition ran low, he crossed open ground to resupply it himself. At one point, according to after-action reports and later citations, Basilone kept multiple machine guns firing by redistributing ammunition and making emergency repairs while enemy forces closed in. The result was not measured in neat numbers or stopwatch timing. It was measured in sustained fire, round after round delivered into advancing formations, breaking assaults before they reached the wire. Japanese units suffered severe losses and were forced to withdraw, leaving the ground littered with evidence of a failed charge. By dawn, the perimeter still held. Basilone's actions that night would earn him the Medal of Honor, not for a single act, but for hours of continuous leadership and improvisation under direct attack. His ability to keep the guns firing altered the course of the engagement and ensured Henderson Field remained in American hands. But the significance of that night goes beyond one man or one medal. It reveals how modern warfare, when stripped of supply chains and comfort, often hinges on individuals who refuse to accept equipment failure as final. Men who modify, adapt, and push weapons past their intended limits because the alternative is collapse. And that is where this story now turns, away from the broader battle and toward the angles through which this moment can be understood. The Japanese assault began just after nightfall on October 24, 1942. It did not come all at once. At first, there were probing attacks, small units feeling for weakness, testing the Marine perimeter with rifle fire and grenades. Then the artillery began. Shells crashed into the jungle and open ground around Henderson Field, tearing trees apart and throwing dirt and metal through the air. The explosions were not random. They walked forward, methodical, preparing the way. Behind them, Japanese infantry moved. They advanced in columns through the darkness, guided by compass bearings and memorized terrain. Many carried light packs. Some wore camouflage. Others relied on speed and shock. Their objective was clear: break through the Marine line, reach the airfield, and destroy the aircraft on the ground before dawn. When the main assault hit, it hit hard. Bugles sounded. Shouts echoed through the jungle. Suddenly, figures emerged from the darkness, running forward in waves. The distance closed fast. Rifles fired. Grenades arced. The night erupted into overlapping fields of fire. Bassilone's sector became one of the primary points of contact. His machine guns opened up immediately, stitching the approach routes with .30 caliber fire. Tracers cut low through the grass. Japanese troops dropped, scattered, or went to ground. For a moment, the defense held as it was supposed to. Then the guns began to fail. Sustained fire in the humid jungle pushed the weapons past their limits. Barrels overheated. Water jackets boiled dry. Ammunition belts twisted and tore. One gun jammed completely, its bolt locked by dirt and heat. Another sputtered, then went silent. In a normal engagement, this would have meant withdrawal or replacement. There was no replacement. Japanese troops were already within grenade range. Bassilone did not wait for instructions. He moved into the open, bullets snapping past him, and reached the first disabled gun. He cleared it by hand, burning his palms on hot metal. When it failed again, he abandoned it and sprinted to another position. He began pulling ammunition from rear dumps and redistributing it where the fire was heaviest. When one gun crew was overwhelmed, he took over himself. When another gun broke down, he stripped parts from it to keep a different weapon running. At one point, with ammunition nearly gone, Bassilone ran several hundred yards through enemy fire to a rear position, loaded himself with belts, and fought his way back to the line. The Japanese assault did not slow. Wave after wave pressed forward, driven by orders that did not allow retreat. But as long as the machine guns stayed alive, even partially, the ground in front of the Marine line became untenable. The firing did not come in bursts anymore. It became continuous. The sound of the guns blended into a single, sustained roar that dominated the sector. The effect was devastating, not just physically but psychologically. Assault formations broke apart. Survivors crawled or fell back into the jungle. Officers attempting to rally their men were cut down. Minutes stretched into hours. By the middle of the night, the ground in front of Bassilone's position was littered with equipment, bodies, and abandoned weapons. Japanese units attempted to flank, then withdrew when they met the same wall of fire. The line bent, but it did not break. And as the hours passed, the outcome of the entire ground assault began to hinge on whether that improvised, overstressed firepower could be kept alive until dawn. The second half of this turning point unfolds in the final hours before morning, when exhaustion, ammunition, and fate all reach their limits. The hours before dawn were the most dangerous. By then, the men on the line were operating on instinct alone. Hands shook from fatigue. Throats were raw from smoke and shouting. Every magazine, every belt of ammunition had been lifted, loaded, and fired countless times. The jungle in front of the Marine positions no longer moved with confidence. It twitched, crawled, and waited. Japanese commanders pressed what they had left. Small groups advanced low to the ground, attempting to slip through gaps created by terrain and fallen trees. Others charged outright, hoping momentum could succeed where planning had failed. Mortar rounds continued to fall, shaking the earth and briefly blinding defenders with dirt and flame. Bassilone remained in constant motion. He no longer belonged to a single gun position. He was everywhere the fire was weakest. When a barrel overheated, he shifted fire to another gun. When a crew went down, he replaced it. When ammunition ran dangerously low, he rationed bursts, not to conserve but to ensure uninterrupted pressure. This was not a calculated modification made on a workbench. It was battlefield adaptation under fire. By rerouting ammunition, alternating guns, and forcing damaged weapons to continue firing beyond their intended duty cycle, Bassilone created the effect of a single, unstoppable firing point. To the attacking Japanese, it appeared as though an entire company of machine guns was waiting for them. The assaults began to stall almost as soon as they formed. Groups that reached the wire were cut down. Others froze in the open, pinned by fire they could not locate or outmaneuver. Officers attempting to reorganize attacks were met with immediate, precise bursts. The rate of fire was not measured in seconds or minutes by those experiencing it. It was measured in survival. According to post-battle assessments, Japanese units attacking that sector suffered catastrophic casualties. Entire formations were effectively neutralized before they could breach the Marine line. Those who survived withdrew into the jungle, leaving the field uncontested. As the sky began to lighten, the firing slowed, not because the threat had ended, but because there was nothing left advancing. At first light on October 25, Marine patrols cautiously moved forward. What they found confirmed what the night had already made clear. The ground in front of the perimeter bore the unmistakable signs of a failed assault: discarded weapons, shattered equipment, and heavy losses that could not be concealed. Henderson Field was still operational. Aircraft that would have been destroyed on the ground were able to take off later that morning, intercepting Japanese reinforcements and sealing the failure of the offensive. The entire campaign shifted as a result. Basilone, when relief finally arrived, was physically spent. His uniform was torn. His hands were burned. His voice was nearly gone. But the guns he had kept alive through the night had done exactly what was required of them. They held. That night marked the turning point of the ground battle for Guadalcanal. Japanese forces would never again mount a coordinated offensive of that scale against the airfield. The initiative began to slip permanently into American hands. But victory in war is never contained within a single night. What followed would ripple outward, through casualty reports, command decisions, and the future of the men who survived that perimeter. Those consequences formed the final chapter of this story. When the sun rose over Guadalcanal on October 25, 1942, the island looked unchanged at first glance. The jungle still stood thick and green. Henderson Field remained a strip of dirt carved out of hostile terrain. But beneath that surface calm, the balance of the campaign had shifted. The Japanese ground assault had failed. In the hours after dawn, Marine patrols moved cautiously beyond the perimeter. What they encountered confirmed the scale of the night's fighting. The approaches to the airfield were strewn with abandoned rifles, packs, and equipment. The signs of heavy casualties were unmistakable. Entire assault units had been broken apart before they could reach their objectives. Exact casualty figures remained debated, as was common in jungle warfare, but Japanese losses in the ground attacks of October 23 to 26 were severe, numbering in the thousands across the battle. Many units were rendered combat ineffective. Officers and veteran NCOs, essential to coordination and morale, had been lost in disproportionate numbers. For the Marines, the cost was also real. Men were killed or wounded holding the line. Machine gun crews had suffered heavily, targeted again and again during the assault. But the perimeter had not collapsed. Henderson Field remained in American hands. That fact alone carried enormous strategic weight. Within hours, Marine and Navy aircraft were back in the air. Japanese reinforcements attempting to reach Guadalcanal by sea were attacked. Transport ships were sunk or driven off. The failure of the ground assault meant Japan could no longer contest air superiority over the island in any meaningful way. The campaign entered a new phase. For the Japanese High Command, the battle marked the beginning of a painful reassessment. The assumption that aggressive infantry tactics could overcome fortified American positions supported by automatic weapons had proven disastrously flawed. Guadalcanal was draining men, ships, and aircraft at a rate Japan could not sustain. For the Marines on the ground, there was no time for reflection yet. Positions were reinforced. Weapons were cleaned, repaired, or replaced. Ammunition was redistributed. The expectation was not celebration, but preparation. Another attack could always come. Amid this aftermath, reports began moving up the chain of command. Accounts from officers and enlisted men repeatedly referenced one machine gun sector that had absorbed the brunt of the assault and held. They described sustained fire under impossible conditions. They described a section leader who moved constantly under fire, keeping weapons alive when they should have failed. These were not exaggerated battlefield stories. They were corroborated, consistent, and detailed. In official after-action reports, the role of Sergeant John Basilone was singled out. Not for a single dramatic act, but for hours of continuous leadership and technical improvisation that directly prevented a breakthrough. The recommendation for the Medal of Honor followed. The citation would later note that Basilone displayed extreme courage and coolness under fire, and that his actions were decisive in repelling the enemy assault. It was recognition not just of bravery but of battlefield intelligence, the ability to understand what mattered most when everything else broke down. Yet even as commendations moved forward, the reality on Guadalcanal remained unchanged. The island was still contested. Disease continued to take its toll. Supplies remained scarce. And the men who had survived the night returned to their positions knowing the war was far from over. The larger consequences of that night, how it reshaped doctrine, memory, and the life of the man at its center, would unfold more slowly, long after the guns fell silent. Those consequences formed the final part of the aftermath. The days following the failed Japanese assault on Henderson Field confirmed the strategic importance of that single night of combat. Guadalcanal was no longer merely a foothold. It had become a symbol of American resilience in the Pacific. Marine positions remained on high alert. Patrols combed the jungle for stragglers and booby traps. Each position that had endured the night of October 24th to 25th was reinforced, repaired, and resupplied where possible. Yet shortages persisted. Ammunition was rationed, water was scarce, and the humid environment continued to corrode equipment. Every day was a reminder that survival relied on both skill and improvisation. The Japanese high command adjusted tactics. Large-scale night assaults, previously their preferred method for penetrating fortified positions, were reconsidered. Instead, they turned to artillery bombardments and infiltration by smaller, specialized units. The failure of the October attack made it clear that traditional massed infantry charges were no longer sufficient against entrenched Marine positions armed with automatic weapons and resilient leadership. For Sergeant John Basilone, the aftermath was both personal and emblematic. He continued to serve with his unit, but he became a figure of legend within the Marine Corps. Fellow Marines remembered the night not only for the ferocity of the fighting, but for the way one man's improvisation had kept multiple machine guns operational when failure seemed inevitable. He had proven that leadership and ingenuity could amplify raw firepower far beyond what was anticipated by manuals or doctrine. Basilone's Medal of Honor citation, issued shortly afterward, emphasized not just bravery, but technical skill under extreme conditions. He had, in effect, modified the battlefield by sustaining weapons beyond their intended limits, redistributing ammunition, and maintaining a continuous field of fire. These were not fictional feats. They were battlefield realities carefully documented in after-action reports. The broader impact extended beyond the individual. Military strategists studying Guadalcanal noted how improvisation and adaptability often proved decisive when standardized equipment and procedures faltered under environmental and tactical stress. Lessons learned here influenced later Marine Corps doctrine, emphasizing flexibility, field maintenance, and the empowerment of non-commissioned officers to make rapid decisions in critical moments. Despite the accolades, the human cost remained palpable. Many of the Marines who survived that night carried scars, both visible and invisible, for the rest of their lives. The enemy dead and wounded bore witness to the intensity of the firefight. The psychological imprint of facing relentless, improvised firepower under night assault left a lasting mark on both sides of the conflict. By the end of October 1942, Guadalcanal had been secured, but the struggle for dominance in the Pacific continued. Henderson Field would remain vital to Allied operations, and the men who held it, including those who improvised weapons under fire, would shape the course of the campaign. The night of Basilone's actions became a touchstone for understanding how individual skill, courage, and ingenuity could influence the outcome of larger strategic objectives. The consequences of that night, on strategy, morale, and military thinking, ultimately set the stage for reflection on what it means when one human being changes the flow of battle, for a moment that stretches beyond the jungle, the guns, and the chaos of war. War is often measured in maps, dates, and casualty reports. But in the shadows of Guadalcanal, it was measured in seconds, instincts, and the hands of one Marine holding a gun that should have failed. Sergeant John Basilone's improvisation was more than technical skill. It was a demonstration of human adaptability under extreme pressure. A weapon was never meant to fire so continuously, yet necessity reshaped it. A man was never meant to hold the line alone, yet leadership amplified the will of an entire unit. That night reveals the quiet truth of combat. Survival depends not only on planning or equipment, but on the willingness to act decisively when every system seems broken. One person's courage can ripple outward, altering strategy, preserving lives, and shaping history. Henderson Field remained in Allied hands. Aircraft took off. Reinforcements were blocked. A Japanese offensive failed. But beyond the immediate tactical victory lies a deeper understanding. War is a crucible where technology meets human determination, where improvisation can become as lethal as any ordnance. The story of that night endures because it reminds us that the tide of battle often turns not with grand plans, but with sustained effort, clarity of mind, and the refusal to yield when all else falters. In the stillness after the guns fell silent, the jungle reclaimed its normal rhythm. Yet the echo of sustained fire, the courage that kept it alive, and the lives it preserved remain a testament to one Marine's ability to bend the tools of war to the will of survival and duty.